So when we think about the history of liberty, right, we have to understand that what the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks who came up with this concept, yeah, what they meant by it was it was a very like limited number of people who were allowed to be free. So women obviously weren't, and slaves obviously weren't, right? So you're talking about a very small amount of the population who had the right in their eyes, yeah, to be free. And within that freedom, it was a thing of people being treated somewhat as equals, right? So in its early days, it was very exclusionary. Now, where it ends up coming more and more towards a system that we come to understand, this is when as we said in the democracy video, right, the prior video, we start to see that the Germanic tribes, which had not been conquered by the Romans, but who still had quite a lot of influence, so their societies were very very kind of democratically kind of run, very much like kind of very much like kind of reinforcing of like kind of the liberties of individual like free men within like those societies, yeah? And so the franchise was like greatly kind of expanded in those terms. So when we start to see the Anglo-Saxons coming across to England, yeah, after the retreat of the Roman Empire, and after Rome abandoned Britain, so when we start to see the kind of settlement of the Anglo-Saxons in England, we start to see more and more of these kind of traditions really start to like be put more into place. And this is why, even after the Norman conquest in 1066, the occupying like conquerors, yeah, still had to, in order to like run England, yeah, they still had to adopt some of the liberties that people had become used to. So even right in 1066, you have something known as the London Charter of Liberties, right? So the City of London, not talking about London as a city, you're talking about the City of London, which is the square mile, right? This is where the big like financial sector, etc., right? This tiny sector, right, has been able to retain throughout all these centuries the same what they called Saxon liberties, yeah, Saxon freedoms, right? And that meant that regardless of what was happening in the rest of the kingdom, the laws of this little tiny square mile, they were able to basically do their own thing, and even to this day, they're able to do their own thing, right? And so as time went on, as the kind of grip of like the Norman conquest kind of slowly loosened, and the Normans became more and more integrated within Britain, like you start to see bit by bit, you start to see more and more liberties, right? You see more and more things being guaranteed, such as trial by jury in 1187, and also around the same time you start to see Glanville, right? So he was one of the noblemen, right? And he was the person who came up with the modern day concept of what we understand as liberty, as in being free from restrictions like from authority, right? So a lot of people have kind of criticized the so there's a kind of patriotic song in Britain, Land of Hope and Glory, Mother of the Free. Now that bit where it says Mother of the Free, what the people singing that meant by that is that of all countries in the world, right, this concept of liberty, this concept of freedom of like the individual, right, came from England, right? Obviously there was some influence from different places as we've discussed, but it's a thing of these ideas really come together and really like start to take root in England and like in nowhere else really, like kind of with some very marginal exceptions. So when people talk about Britain being the mother of the free, that's essentially what they mean. They mean that England was like the first place that kind of where these ideas actually started to take root. And this all really culminated with the famous Magna Carta of 1215, right? So Magna Carta, like kind of the great document as such, right? Kind of the Great Charter. This is where we really start to think about, right? So as we discussed in the last video when we talked about democracy, this is the first time where we clearly see instances where a king has been told by his noblemen that they are entitled to the same rights as he's entitled to, that the king cannot just arrest people without trial, like that the king has to respect people, like he has to respect people, right? And he can't just rule completely by himself, right? And so this is the first kind of like document that really enshrines the rights of people, right? Not everyone. It didn't extend. This first Magna Carta didn't extend to everyone. It just was pretty much that group of nobles. But as time went on, that sense of who's entitled to freedom became ever more expanded. And you start seeing time and time again. You start to see in 1628, you start seeing in 1679, and you start seeing in you see the culmination of all this in 1689, which is all of these are bills of rights, right? So this is every single one of these. This is different ones where the freedom of the citizens of the country, every single person born in this country, or every single person who lives in this country, has these rights of liberty, right? So this is freedom from arrest without a warrant, freedom from freedom to bear arms, freedom for all these different things, right? So the early kind of freedoms that we kind of like think of, like to protect the citizens from a tyrannical government, all of these start getting laid out in the 17th century, and this is as part of the clashes between the Stuart ruling dynasty and the Parliament, right? So you see this in the English Civil War. You see all these kind of things, the tensions between the king and the Parliament in this time. This is what ends up bringing forth a lot of these kind of rights being really enshrined within the UK Constitution. So now again, we start to see with these debates, again, a debate in these early days about how far should this concept of liberty be expanded, How many, does it extend to women? Does it extend to children? Does it extend to, non-British people? Does it extend to people of colour, right? So all of these debates people continually had and stuff, right? So you start thinking of great thinkers such as Locke, who we've discussed previously, who we can kind of think of as like the intellectual kind of like founding father of a lot of what we think of as like liberal political thought, right? Like a belief in life, liberty, and property. That the role of the state is to protect these against a tyrannical government. We start to see people during the Enlightenment period. You start to see people like Thomas Paine arguing for these things, and obviously the huge influence that he had in America. And again, the US founding fathers were really they sought to found the American Republic on these high ideals, right? They sought to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, what's interesting about the pursuit of happiness is this, right? The pursuit of happiness, that phrase was put in as a compromise, and I'll explain why. So, if we say life, liberty, and property, right? In America, at the time of the founding fathers, right? At the time of the American Revolution, when they're drafting, and afterwards when they're drafting the Constitution, even then, many years before the Civil War, there were huge debates raging about slavery, right? And, if you write property, you immediately end up having two different competing views of what is property, right? You have the people who believe that human beings cannot be someone else's property, and then you have obviously the slave owners, or the people who support them, who believe that human beings, or rather, are they human beings at all? That kind of, being in favour of Africans being enslaved, pretty much, right? So these debates were raging during this time, and so to put a kind of damper on it, they said, right, okay, what we'll have is we'll just pick something fluffy, the pursuit of happiness, right? Who could be against that, right? So the pursuit of happiness was a compromise because of the debates around slavery, and also as well, the pursuit of happiness. Like I've discussed this like kind of like in other things, and I'll probably discuss it in a future video about how the pursuit of happiness is kind of shaky grounds, like kind of like but anyway, without going into all that now. So again, we start having the like kind of we have debates about this. We later have John Stuart Mill, who wrote On Liberty, and he's a like Victorian writer, and what he said is like like I already said about the societal the pressures from society are often sometimes worse than any tyranny from government, and oftentimes any tyranny from government is influenced by the tyrannical impulses of the wider society. But he also said, quite controversially in a way, that children could not have liberty because they were bereft of reason, right? So, like, it's the job of the parent, it's the job of the teacher, or the job of like adults, to take care of kids because they're not old enough to be able to take care of themselves. They're a potential risk to themselves, and so they need to be guided. So regardless of what they want to do, they need to have authority figures telling them what to do. Which I suppose if like anyone has ever dealt with any kids before, like kind of you can see how it might be not the most popular idea amongst them, but as one gets older, one can begin to understand this, and this is why, for instance, we don't have like children having the right to vote. So the problem with that is this was the time of imperialism, right? And John Stuart Mill, like many other people of that time, were a product of their time, and so he extended this same reasoning with regard to children, and basically said that the subject peoples of the empire, i.e. the Indians, the Africans, etc., they were also in a way children, and so they didn't have the same right to liberty. And so he used that argument as a justification for why, even though Britain was meant to be the land of the free, like kind of like Britons never shall be slaves, etc., he used this as a kind of like justification for saying, actually, the people we're enslaving, or the people we're colonizing, they're not really, they're children, so we can do whatever we kind of want with them, right? So so you can see already that liberalism, it's a very, from modern eyes, it's had a very bumpy history, but at the same time, it has laid a lot of the foundations for the society that we live in now. And so we're going to get on to some of that now.